I feel like sometime we should sing "We're All in Our Places" with sunshiny faces on the Lord's Day. Good to see you, and whether you're physically present or online, thank you for being with us. If you'll be turning to Mark chapter 6, we're going to be reading a section from that here in just a second. And what we want to do today is that, and if you have the outline under number 1 in bold there, Jesus has sent out the 12 apostles, and as I always read this, I kind of shudder, giving these guys the ability to heal and cast out demons and other stuff, because they're also going to be the guys who like to call down fire from heaven. They're the guys who want to keep the little children away from Jesus. They don't understand the spiritual nature of the kingdom. And to me, a bottom line today is that Jesus is going to send out the 12, and then Mark will record the death of John the Baptist in Mark 16:14 through 29. We're going to have the feeding of the 5,000, and then Jesus is going to walk on water. But here's something to me that's very interesting. You send out 12 guys to, quote, preach the gospel, and within a couple of days, we're going to have 5,000 men, and eventually women and children, run around the top of the Sea of Galilee and end up in a desolate, a desert place waiting for Jesus. When's the last time 5,000 men have ran anywhere and didn't remember to bring something to eat? I mean, think about it. When's the last time 5,000 men got so caught up and involved in something that they're going to run around? Yes, sir. Very good. And yes, Woodstock would count for that. But just think about that from just kind of an energy and momentum point of view. To me, it's very clear the apostles have been saying, we found the Messiah. We're about to go to Jerusalem and establish the kingdom. And this is like the beginning, in their mind, of a physical kingdom, because what's their favorite discussion? It borders on two things. Who's going to sit on the right hand and who's going to sit on the left hand, and who is the greatest? They're not thinking of heaven. That's not even in the paradigm. I believe they're thinking of, we're going to reestablish the kingdom in Jerusalem. This will involve the overthrow of the Romans, and we have found the long-awaited king. And you send 12 guys out to, quote, preach, and Mark will tell us 4 of the parables, like the parable of the sower, the parable of the weeds, and other things, and they have kind of a handful of things to talk about. But what is scary is their interpretation at this particular point of the ministry of what they're talking about. So CI, central idea, I want us to look today at the result of sending out 12 apostles, and we're going to see it's going to be 5,000 men running to a desert place, which again, from their point of view, they're going to be really excited and really psyched up about this, that their initial preaching tour has been so successful in gathering that many people together. And then I also want us to look and see how each of the gospel, not each, but how the gospel writers use this. And from the birth of Jesus to the triumphal entry, all the gospels are going to mention the triumphal entry in the last week, but from the birth of Jesus to the triumphal entry, the feeding of the 5,000 is the only event that's in all 4 gospels. And as Bill said, when you look at miracles, if you count, obviously we would think of the resurrection as a miracle. The only miracle that is in all 4 gospels is the feeding of the 5,000 and the resurrection of Jesus. A part of why we're reading Mark today, and again, just a quick review, and I still just, you never quite get this all totally figured out, but 90% of the Gospel of Mark is in Matthew. 50% of the Gospel of Mark is in Luke. And in all, Between just those two books, 94% of what's in the Gospel of Mark is in either Matthew or Luke. But what's interesting is that because Matthew's going to have these 5 blocks of teaching, Sermon on the Mount, other things like that, then when it comes to narrative and it comes to stories and it's even miracles, then Matthew and Luke are going to compress the narrative stories from the Gospel of Mark. So if you look at one of these, here's all the Gospels in order. The event like we're looking at today is going to be given more print in Mark, which is the shortest Gospel, than it is in the other two. And I think a part of the reason for that is both of these guys are going to include, in Matthew's case, these 5 huge blocks of teaching. And remember, Moses went up on the mountain, received the 10 commandments. He gave the people the law. Jesus is going to come out of Egypt. Out of Egypt I've called my son. He's also going to go through the water of Jordan where the Israelites had crossed into the promised land earlier. And then he's going to go up on a mountain. He sits down. He opens his mouth and he teaches them the Sermon on the Mount. So Matthew's going to include these. Luke, as we're going to see, has a whole group of parables that aren't in the others. And so when you look at a narrative and particularly a miracle of all things, the shortest gospel will give you more details and more account of that. 2 other things just to kind of keep in place as we continue to fix our eyes on Jesus. To me, this is just amazing. When you look at the Gospel of John, only 7% of John is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Let me say the same thing. 93% of what's in the Gospel of John is not in the first 3 books. And then when you put them all together, 30% of our 4 gospel accounts is about the last week. And just kind of think about that. In all, the most, and I'm talking about individual days, the most individual days that we have of the life of Jesus, the highest count I've read someone is 40, and a lot of times you'll see close to 30 or 31. So just always kind of keep that in mind as you're reading the Gospels. We have approximately a month of individual days of the life of Jesus. And then you'll see why John says many other signs and wonders Jesus did in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And John, being an eyewitness, is just saying there's a whole bunch of stuff we didn't get to tell. So with that selectivity and brevity, then it's even more significant to me that 4 Gospels, one written to Jews, I think Mark to the Romans, Luke writes to Theophilus in the Greek mind, and then John is just written this, that you may believe. All 4 of the writers look through the life of Jesus and come to this conclusion. The one thing that all of them felt like had to be included was this feeding of the 5,000. So especially if you're listening online or at home, we're going to turn to Mark 6. And I want to just read the account, and then we're going to come back and look at some selective items that take place. The apostles, Mark 6:30, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. So see what I'm saying? When I read Mark, Mark is like being down on the coast and the tide comes in and the tide goes out. The tide comes in, the tide goes out. And in Mark, they will be coming to Jesus. He both will send them out. There's teaching missions and things involved. And there's this constant kind of coming and going. And in this case, the 12, having been given what we call the limited commission, have gone out. And now they come back and they start reporting, this is what we found and this is what happened and all the things that took place. Then, because so many people were coming and going, they did not even have a chance to eat. He said to them, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. This is a little bit of a side, but to me this is really important. Dear friend Don Van Zant preached at the Edmond Church for years and years. And with that wonderful Texas Fort Worth drawl, he said, the most important thing that a tired Christian can do is sleep. And you stop and think, when we haven't got enough sleep and we're not quiet ourselves, we're just vulnerable to a whole group of things. And he just said, one of the most important things a tired Christian can do is sleep. Being at Eastside for decades, one of our young mothers came up one Sunday and she said, and the daughter was small, she says, my daughter was fussy and she wasn't doing very well, and I took her outside and she said, I happened to stand under the speaker and she got to hearing your voice, and just in 30 seconds she was just out like a light. And she said, I got to thinking, even probably from the inside, she said, but from the moment she's been able to hear, she's heard your voice. Your voice has just been a constant in her life. And I said, look, I'm multi-talented. It's not just babies. I can do this with teenagers. I can do this with young adults. I can do this with older people. Just put them out like a light, and multi-talented in that sense. We had a brother who sometimes worked until 4 o'clock on Sunday morning. How awake are you going to be in church if you've worked all night and you get off work and then go home for a little bit? And sometimes he'd apologize, and I says, don't. We know whose side you're on. You're doing the very best you can. And if you physically need to rest, you need to do that. And even in a spiritually minded world, Jesus is conscious. So many people we need to get away and rest for a while. I'm not going to go into this great detail, but the Sabbath rest in the Old Testament is not commanded in the New. But I think one of the things we've neglected to our harm is just taking time to get away, be with Jesus, be still, be quiet, and maybe sometimes even sleep. I mentioned this recently. For nearly 25 years, I did 2 sermons, either 2 or 3 classes a week, and then obviously all the other stuff that goes on. And in one year, I did 40 funerals. So I promise you, if you've done a Bible class and 2 sermons on Sunday, and you have a funeral on Monday morning, on Wednesday morning, a Wednesday night class, a Thursday morning class, a Friday morning funeral, and 2 sermons coming on Sunday, you're just beat like a drum. So, and thankfully the funerals were in the morning. And so on Wednesday, I went home and went to bed. Did the funeral, but I knew I've got Wednesday night, I've got a Thursday class, I've got a Friday funeral, and I've got 2 sermons on Sunday. The best thing I can do is just go home and rest. And I just say that because we can get so hectic in other things that it detracts us, the things that are temporal, from the things that are eternal. And Jesus says, I want you to come away with me by yourselves to a quiet place, and I want you to rest. Good idea. But what happens? Well, they went away by themselves in a boat to a desert, a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. So we're going to be at the upper end of the Sea of Galilee, up on the north end, and they're kind of on this side, and Jesus is going to say, okay, we're going to go over to, kind of like if we're on the lake, we're going to go over to the lighthouse. We're going to sail across the Sea of Galilee and go over to the other side. We're going to have some quiet time and rest a little bit. And what happens? All these people get to recognizing, we can see the direction that they're going. We know where they're going to land. And so from all of these towns and villages, then this whole crowd of people goes ahead of them. And when they get there to rest, here are 5,000 men. You're not going to get a lot of rest with that many guys who have come together. Notice what happens. When Jesus landed and saw the large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and so he began to teach them many things. By this time it was late in the day, and so his disciples came to him and said, this is a desert place, this is a remote place, and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. And Jesus says, now you give them something to eat. And think about this. He sent them out, the 12. They've come back, reported, Here's this huge mass of people that I think they're probably responsible for gathering together. And Jesus says, well, why don't you guys feed them? And you can just see them just thinking, okay, this is impossible. They said to him, it would take 8 months of a man's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them eat? And he said, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And they found out, and they said, we have, and again, be thinking more of like a biscuit or a roll. Don't be thinking of Wonder Bread. Think of something, he's a little boy. We found 5, make sure we get it right, 5 little morsels of bread and 2 fish. And I'm going to maintain this is not the word for a fish with scales and a head. This is a word for fish that something's been cooked or broiled or something. And again, if you've got a little bitty guy, he's not going to be carrying around very large chunks of fish or bread. And so we've got probably a snack for a little boy, and we got 5,000 men. For, I don't know, since close to 2000, Eastside has fed the Carl Albert football team on Fridays. Wonderful coach came to us and said, if we provide all the stuff, we pay for everything, but if you can help with people and a menu, he said, do you have any idea how much trouble 90 guys can get into from when school's out and it's time to get dressed for a football game? He said, they're all psyched. He said, if they could just come and they have to be there at a certain time and we feed them and all this other stuff, and said, we'd love to do that. And especially older guys that are retired or if they had ever played football, if I could get them to come one time, they just came back. The guys would have their jersey on, yes, sir, no, sir. And I'd explain to them, I said, if you've got 90 guys, high school boys, after school who are going to have something to eat, it's like turning on an industrial vacuum cleaner. It's going to go, and it's gone. And that's what happened. If you have 90 high school football players having a pre-game meal at 3 o'clock, whatever you put out, there's no leftovers, there's nothing to take home. And if you have 90 high school boys that you're feeding at 3 o'clock, it's just, and it's gone. Can you imagine 5,000 men? I mean, for you ladies who've helped with potluck, can you even just imagine what's going to be involved in feeding 5,000 men? And so Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups in the green grass. They sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looking up into heaven, he gave thanks. He broke the loaves, he gave them to his disciples to set before the people. He divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 baskets of broken pieces of bread and fish, and the number of men who had eaten was 5,000. Now, none of the gospel writers give us any more details other than Jesus just gives thanks, he breaks this, but to miraculously feed 5,000, and we're going to see a little bit later, Matthew's going to add, and there were women and children. So we don't have a determined number. If you have women and children with 5,000 men, how many people are there? 7, 10,000, depending upon how many women and children came with them. So this is just a huge thing. The thing that's significant is that all of this takes place in the desert, in a desolate place. And in the book of Mark, I'll just do this very quickly verbally. Here's John the Baptist. John the Baptist is preaching. He's in the wilderness, and people are being baptized. Then when we're introduced to Jesus, and here's the opposite, he is baptized, he goes into the wilderness, and then he comes out preaching. And on either end of these, the preaching and the baptizing are the 2 events in the ministry of John and the ministry of Jesus that are introduced in the first 15 verses of Mark. But what do they have in common? They take place out in a wilderness area, out in a desert. And so when we have the feeding of the 5,000 and you have these 5,000 people run around the Sea of Galilee, then we also have another event that takes place in a desolate area. If you look at the dotted line, if you have an outline nearly 2/3 of the way down, I mentioned this, Matthew 14:21. He will say, besides women and children. And the two closest cities in this general area, one is Capernaum and the other is Bethsaida. And people can dig out information like this from Roman tax laws and other stuff, but the estimates are that these two cities were probably close to 2,000 people, at the most 3,000. So the two largest cities in the area are maybe 2,000 at Capernaum up just on this side of the Jordan River, and then Bethsaida is around on this side. And so here are two cities that the largest population of these cities is 3,000 people. And I'm just thinking, and where are 5,000 people going to find something to eat if your city is only a city of 2,000 to 3,000? And this is, again, a part of this just amazement of getting these people together. And as we're going to see, the apostles are so psyched up. They're just about to bust because everything's happening, the kingdom's at hand, all of these things are taking place, and all these people have come together. So here's number one under the dotted line. You send 12 apostles out to preach and heal. Their version of the kingdom is at hand. And you end up with 5,000 men from all of the towns running on foot to get to the other side ahead of the lake before the boat gets there. Listen to these Old Testament echoes. And we're going to do two things. One, and I like the word echo in that, like, for example, the little boy Samuel, remember Samuel asked of God. The little boy Samuel is going to be sent to be raised with Eli in the tabernacle. And then here's this wonderful phrase, Samuel grew, and I won't get this exactly right, but something like he grew in wisdom and in stature, some other things, talking about a little boy growing up there. We're going to hear an echo with John the Baptist as a young boy. He's also going to grow in these things. And then remember in Luke 2:52, Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. And you hear this echo, oh yes, that's like what the little boy Samuel was like when he grew up. And so here are some Old Testament, and they're not just fulfillment things, but we're going to hear similarities and parallels. Number one, Moses fed Israel, at least the Israelites said this, what? In the desert? Manna. And took care of them. Jesus is going to say, well, God actually did this. Moses was involved in that. But you stop and think. The feeding of people in a desert, in the case of the 5,000, you hear an echo, something very similar happened with Moses feeding the 5,000. The wilderness wanderings, Israel wandering around that 40 years, were sometimes described as sheep without a shepherd. And you stop and think, a flock of sheep with no shepherd and no protection are very, very vulnerable. And there's also going to be, go ahead and mention this, in the military terms, sheep without a shepherd is also used of an army without a general. But let's stay with the Old Testament. And we're going to find Israel's future Davidic king is going to be a shepherd. And you remember the original David literally does sheep, but Jesus is going to be described and pictured as the coming shepherd. Moses, encouraged by his father-in-law, is going to organize Israel in their larger groups, but it's thousands, hundreds, 50s, and 10s. And then the two prophets, Elijah is going to feed the widow of Zarephath during a famine, but Elisha is going to feed 100 men miraculously. And when we come to this one account in the Gospels, here are some things that I think are kind of echoes. They're similar to things that happened in the Old Testament. But there's also a strong military sense in this passage, and look at the things that are here. The 12 are intent on a physical kingdom. You know, this is just, I would be really discouraged if we're in the upper room and just maybe for safety concerns, you say, are there any swords? And Peter says, we've got two. And Peter's going to cut a guy's ear off that you need to be a part of being sure that you get betrayed, to get crucified, to save the world. And then here's Peter intent on saving you even physically. And it's dangerous for Peter to have a sword in his hand because his whole mentality is thinking of a physical kingdom, even up to that point. And this is what I think about the 12. There's just a real sense of accomplishment and a real sense of pride in look what we've done. We've gone out on our first preaching tour and we've taught about the kingdom, and how successful could we be that we have 5,000 men who've run around the lake, and these guys are just really, really excited about the success of their preaching about the coming of the kingdom. When you look at the word coming and going, this is sometimes used in the Old Testament. I'm Caleb, I'm as strong as I used to be, for coming and going. Here's an 85-year-old man who said, I can fight with 20-year-olds mentality. I'm as strong as I was. I'm still capable. And see, coming and going is a military sense. David and Joab, and you have Abner here. Joab says he's deceived you. He wants to know your coming and going. He wants to know your movements. And so when you read through the Old Testament, there are also very specific military contexts where this term in Mark is used. Men are coming and going. The groups of 150s, I'm sure this is probably for the convenience of feeding. If you just have this whole mass of people, at some point you need to either have, can I say, some rows, some division to be able to start passing food out. And just stop and think, how big of an area are you going to need to seat 5,000 men? I mean, just mentally kind of think about this. And then when you add Matthew's comment, oh, and then in addition there were women and children, this is not a Sunday picnic. This is a huge, huge event. But because of the mentality of the apostles, groups of 150s is how military also organizes themselves as well. And you can see from their side, they're going to see something very, very different than Jesus did. But here's a verse, and this is in John, and this is very, very significant. When John finishes talking about the feeding of the 5,000, he simply says about the people, seeing they intended to come and make him a king by force. Okay, think about that. He's fed the 5,000, and what does the 5,000 have in common? Jerry, I'm going to come lay hands on you. Whether you want to do this or not, we're going to make you king. That's one way to help keep people awake in class. But think about it. This is not what Jesus is about, but he's fed these 5,000 men, and John tells us very specifically, this is why they're there. But you stop and think about it. Greg, we've seen this guy raise the dead. We don't have to worry about supply lines. We've watched him feed 5,000. All of the components that we need to overthrow the Romans is there, and they're not thinking about heaven, and they're not thinking about the right hand of God. They're thinking about Jerusalem, and this is why Jesus is going to dismiss the crowd. And as we're going to see, he makes the apostles get in the boat, and none of them want to get in the boat. But let's keep looking at this. So this is 4-5. They plan to make Jesus a king. And then here's 4-6, and we're back in Mark 6:45. Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. We had a Greek teacher in Memphis, and he said, I literally think he probably laid hands on them. He said, I kind of have this picture of kind of 1 foot on the shore and 1 foot on the boat, and grabbing apostles and putting them in the boat, because they are so excited. We've got 5,000 men. They're wanting to make him a king by force. And you want to do what? You want us to get in a boat and leave this when we've worked hard and got all these people there, and they don't want to have anything to do with it. And Jesus forces, he made them get in the boat, and not a one of them wanted to do that. What I want you to see, and this is in 4:7, then Jesus is going to go away by himself for a while. A storm comes up. He's walking on the water. He passes by them. They're alarmed. Is this the ghost? They're also afraid they're going to drown. Jesus gets in the boat. He calms the storm. And Mark tells us, and I'm literally going to do this with my hand, he says, their hearts were hardened. They're ticked off. They are really, really frustrated. We've done our part. We've gone out and preached to these people. We got 5,000 people together. You stick us out here in a boat, we're about to drown, and then you come walking by. And at the time, none of them really recognize or appreciate either the miracle or the significance of what Jesus is doing. This is why, and this is very comforting to me, this is why in John you will keep hearing these passages like, and this is in the upper room, Jesus says to the apostles, "Howbeit, when he, the Spirit of truth, is come, he will guide you into all truth, and he will bring to your remembrance everything that I have told you." Well, the reason that is so important is that they're going to be with him the whole time and miss the major point of what he's doing while they're with him in the flesh. And how much between the ascension, when he goes back into heaven, and that 40 days before Pentecost do they begin to understand? But this is going to be a long process. Easy to remember. Cornelius in Acts 10 is a decade after Pentecost. Okay? So if this is the cross and here's Acts 2, then the adding of our first Gentile into the church is going to be 10 years later. And to get Peter to go talk to a Gentile, this vision of this sheet comes down to heaven, and what does the voice say? Rise and kill and eat. And Peter says, I've never touched anything unclean. Translated, I haven't been with unclean animals, and I haven't been with those unclean people who are Gentiles. And do you notice how he explains to his Jews later, this was a vision from God. You went and ate with Gentiles. So even a decade later, they still don't understand the design of the church. And one of my favorite verses in the book of Revelation is that in the holy city, there are going to be people from every tribe, every tongue, every people, and every nation. And it's going to take decades, even after the ministry of Jesus, for that to completely sink in. And then I laugh when I read 1 Peter, Cappadocia, Bithynia, all these places in Asia, and Peter is spending the latter part of his ministry with Gentiles, and then eventually goes to the city of Rome. When Jesus calls him from the nets and says, "Follow me, I'll make you fishers of men," he could never have comprehended that that was what was going to happen in the long run. And as we said, their hearts are hardened. And they're going to miss the point of all the things that happen in this particular section. I hope this is okay. I use the word interns, meaning the apostles in their learning process. What have they learned about ministry at this point? There's times you can need to get rest, and people's needs are going to come up, whether you can schedule that or not. Oh, come away, let's get some rest. And here you are with the intent of getting some rest, and 5,000 people show up. And as we try to serve and minister to people, it's not always going to be on a schedule, and it's not always going to be even convenient. The word compassion. Jesus sees the crowd. He has a feeling of compassion. When I hear the word compassion, I think of the word compel. Compassion is something that, well, let me say it this. If you're in your car at the street corner and I've got a sign, "I'm hungry and I need food," how much eye contact do you make with me in your car if I'm standing on the street corner with the sign? See what I'm saying? Whereas compassion is something that we see a situation, we see a person, and compassion, rather than just recognizing, oh, here's someone and I don't want to make eye contact with them, compassion compels you to do something. And two examples always stand out in my mind. The priest and the Levite went by on the other side of the road. The Samaritan saw him and he felt compassion. He's compelled to do something. The father has been looking down the road to see if the prodigal is ever going to come home. He sees him at a distance and he runs to him. And when you come across this word compassion, which is something that's a part of the ministry of Jesus, compassion is something that compels us to act, and the feeding of the 5,000 is an act of compassion. There are two meals served in Mark 6. One is in the palace of King Herod. The other meal is served in the desert. Look at the contrast, both in terms of the food and the atmosphere and the other things, but there's a huge contrast between the two. Ben Witherton said, the feeding of the 5,000 was simple food for simple folks, and it turned out simply fine. And what was probably a snack for a little boy in his pouch then became the materials for feeding the others. If you were Peter, and I'm thinking about the feeding of the 5,000 and these other things, how many times did you retell this story in your ministry? You can just hear it, you know. You wouldn't believe what happened one day when we were with Jesus. And these apostles are going to tell these stories as they go out and part of their teaching and their ministry. But how different is going to be Peter's application 20 years later than what he is thinking when the event takes place? So quickly, here's some things from John. We've done mostly from Mark, but this is just a nice study in contrast, and we'll do these very quickly. Jesus asked Philip about the food, and Philip is from Bethsaida, which is close by. So this is interesting to me. He asked one of the apostles who lived in this area, how are we going to feed these 5,000 using your local knowledge? But it's Andrew, John tells us, who found the little boy. And what you see, remember, Andrew goes and finds his brother Peter. Later, Andrew is going to see the Greeks who want to see Jesus. We have three accounts, and Andrew's not the one who's featured in the sermons. Andrew's not the one we hear about in the book of Acts. But what do we know about Andrew? Every chance he gets, he's bringing people to Jesus. And I think what a commendable example and something for us to think about in our lives as well. So here's the word loaves. John tells us they're barley loaves, and barley is a lower grade than wheat. So we're not even going to have really proper wheat rolls, bread. And so here is a small boy, and the word fish that's here is used oftentimes of something that's cooked and prepared. I don't doubt that it's fish, but like I said, I don't know what you'd have in mind earlier, but it's not like a fish with scales, and it's probably a smaller piece of prepared cooked meat and maybe 5 little rolls and biscuits. And Jesus is going to give thanks, distribute them, and from this small boy's lunch, look at how much he does with so little. When you look at the ministry of Jesus, nothing little is insignificant. And sometimes, using a more current expression, people think of ministry in terms of leaping over big buildings and huge mounds and doing great things. Do you remember Jesus says, even if you give a cup of what? Cold water in my name. And let's not forget that ministry to others as we live and as we work may be, at the bottom line, doing small things for other people and taking that opportunity, especially if it's a product of compassion. So they're going to feed the 5,000, collect the 12 baskets left over. Some people, I don't know what they're going to do with the 12 baskets. Some people have a hard time eating leftovers. And if you've collected all this, but at least 12 baskets are left over from everything. And John then is going to say, Jesus is going to teach, I am the bread of life. So we're going to feed the 5,000, and he's going to talk about Jesus being the bread of life. And so here's the last thing. Jesus is not interested in a physical kingdom. He's interested in the kingdom that's in heaven. And I still love this expression. The kingdom is God's rule in the human heart. It's not a throne in Jerusalem. It's not the right and the left hand. It's when God rules in our hearts. And later, the apostles are going to understand, but I'm confident at the time, they miss the biggest point of the feeding of the 5,000, but compassion compelled Jesus to serve other people. And I think that's a good model for us to follow in our lives as well. God bless.